we often think we understand communication across cultures, but our tools, our perspectives, actually getting in the way sometimes.
That's a really interesting starting point because today we're diving into exactly that, some critical views on intercultural communication.
Yeah, looking at things like Eurocentrism, how non-Western ideas often get pushed aside, and crucially, power. How does power shape these interactions?
Exactly. We want to unpack these critical larses using Asantai's work and some discussions on refugee representation as our
The
guides.
goal here is really to get a richer, more nuanced picture, right? To sharpen how we analyze these things.
Precisely. And it starts with understanding the history. A lot of the traditional theories, they came out of Western universities.
And we're treated as universal, I guess.
Pretty much. For a long time, they were seen as the way to understand intercultural communication, regardless of where in the world you were looking.
So this Eurocentric intellectual imperialism, it's more than just geography then. It's about assuming Western ideas just work everywhere.
Yeah, that's the core of it. And you see the problems pretty quickly. A theory based on, say, North American communication styles might completely miss the mark in East Asia, for example.
Like trying to explain, I don't know, baseball using cricket rules. You'd get some things, maybe, but miss a lot.
That's a good analogy. The fundamental assumptions might be different.
Which brings us to the researcher, doesn't it? Our own backgrounds must play a role. Talk about self-reflexivity. What is that exactly?
Self-reflexivity is basically the researcher turning the lens inward. It means really looking hard at your own culture, your biases, your assumptions, and asking, how might these be shaping my research?
So being upfront about where you're coming from.
Yes, and how that perspective influences everything, the questions you ask, how you interpret the data. It's about transparency, really. It helps others understand why you might see things a certain way.
Because nobody researches in a total vacuum. And is that why there's this talk of a multicultural era emerging in the field?
I think so. There's a growing sense that we need to actively look for and incorporate theories and insights from all over the globe, not just the West. There's valuable knowledge everywhere.
Which leads right into the next issue, overlooking indigenous or non-Western perspectives. It often feels like these cultures are studied but not really learned from, theoretically speaking.
That's a historical pattern, unfortunately. Non-Western cultures often become the subjects of study, analyzed using Western frameworks, but their own rich traditions of thought about communication and society. They're often not given the same weight in academic conversations.
So they're looked at, but not necessarily listened to for their unique theoretical contributions.
That's a good way to put it. You might see representations in films or media, perhaps.
But that's not the same as engaging with their actual ideas, is it?
Not at all. That's more surface level. The real shift needs to be in prioritizing understanding and even developing theory from these perspectives that have often been on the margins.
And what happens when we do that? When we enrich the field with these diverse viewpoints?
Well, it gives us a much fuller picture, obviously. It challenges assumptions we might not even know we have, especially those rooted in Western thinking.
And what about looking at the West from a non-Western perspective? Is there value there too?
Absolutely. It can be incredibly insightful when you apply, say, an African or Asian theoretical lens to Western culture. It can highlight things that people within that culture take for granted or don't see. It forces a kind of self-reflection.
So it's like holding up a different kind of mirror.
Exactly. These alternative views often pick up on nuances or critiques that are just missed from the inside.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly to power. It seems pretty obvious that when people from different cultures interact, there isn't always an equal balance of power.
Right. It's a fundamental reality. One person or group might have more status, more resources, more institutional authority. But perhaps surprisingly, traditional intercultural communication studies haven't always put this front and center.
Why do you think that is? Was it maybe too uncomfortable or just not seen as core to communication?
It could be a mix of things, maybe an overemphasis on cultural difference as the only factor, or perhaps an idealistic view of communication. But power profoundly shapes how communication happens, who gets heard, whose perspective matters.
And Pillar's idea connects to this, right? That culture really becomes visible when there's a kind of struggle over whose version of reality, whose cultural norms get to be dominant.
Yes, Pillar's work highlights that culture isn't just the static thing people have, it's actively negotiated, especially when power is unequal. And this negotiation happens constantly in everyday conversations, in workplaces, and very visibly in the media.
Whose stories get told, whose don't.
Precisely. Who sets the agenda? Whose values are presented as normal or desirable? That's all tied up with power.
So future research really needs to tackle this head on. Not just acknowledge power, but analyze how it works in communication.
Definitely. And look for ways to encourage more equitable interaction. It's not just about describing the problem, but thinking about solutions too.
And how can researchers actively do that? Are there specific strategies?
Well, our sources suggest a couple of key approaches. One is to really scrutinize inequalities and stereotypes, especially how they pop up in media.
So identifying those problematic portrayals.
Yes, analyzing how certain groups are represented, whose voices are amplified, and whose are maybe distorted or silenced. It's critical media analysis, essentially.
Okay, that makes sense. And the other strategy?
The other is about actively bringing marginalized voices into the research itself. Not just studying about certain groups, but creating space for them to share their own perspectives, their own experiences in their own words.
Giving them the platform.
Exactly. It's about amplifying those often excluded voices to counter dominant narratives.
So combining that critical analysis of existing stuff with actively including marginalized perspectives, that sounds like a path towards, well, a fairer understanding.
It helps move towards more socially just research and hopefully practice.
Let's apply this now. Media representations of refugee migration seem like a really potent example of these dynamics at play.
Absolutely. The sources point to two dominant ways. Western media often frames refugees, and both are pretty problematic.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's the refugees as a threat narrative. This often focuses on numbers, potential security risks, strains on resources. It paints them as a danger.
Creating fear, essentially.
Yes. And the second narrative is refugees as victims. Helpless, passive, needing to be rescued.
Which sounds more sympathetic, maybe, but still limiting.
Very limiting. Both narratives strip people of their complexity and agency. They become stereotypes, not individuals. The threat narrative often uses alarming statistics like hundreds arriving daily, which just fuels the fear.
And these narratives don't just exist on their own, do they? They connect with other biases.
For sure. They intersect with things like race, religion, gender. Think about the example given. Young Muslim men refugees. They're often disproportionately portrayed as culturally alien, maybe even threatening.
That's intersectionality, right? How different parts of someone's identity combine to shape how they're seen or discriminated against.
Exactly. It's not just one factor, but how they overlap and interact in media portrayals.
It leads to such a narrow picture, doesn't it? Like we rarely see refugees just as people, with lives and histories.
That's a really key limitation highlighted. The media coverage often lacks depth. Where are the individual stories? Why did they have to leave? What were their lives like before? They tend to be talked about rather than given a chance to speak.
Silenced, in a way.
Effectively, yes. Even the humanitarian focus on, say, vulnerable families or children.
Which seems positive on the surface.
It can still oversimplify. It often ignores their strength, their resilience, their skills, the complexity of their experiences. It fits them neatly into a victim box.
So if these dominant narratives are so flawed, what's the alternative? How can media do better?
The key seems to be finding ways to rehumanize refugees, shifting the focus towards alternative narratives.
Like what kind of narratives?
Narratives that show their everyday lives, their struggles, yes, but also their hopes, their jobs, their contributions, their interactions within new communities, the mundane, the ordinary stuff that makes us all human.
And the idea is that focusing on the everyday helps bridge the gap.
Exactly. It allows audiences, especially in the West, to connect on a human level, to see shared experiences rather than just difference or threat. It pushes back against those dehumanizing stereotypes.
And this isn't just a Western media issue, is it?
No, the sources mention similar patterns elsewhere. For instance, research in Lebanon also found media often portraying Syrian refugees through that same lens, either as a threat or as passive victims.
The material specifically mentions work on Syrian female refugees. What did that research find?
That was interesting. El Halou and Bouzaid found that Western media tended to focus heavily on young men, often overlooking women's experiences.
So women's voices were even more marginalized.
It seems so, and even within Lebanese media, that threat-victim dichotomy was still common.
But what happens when these women do get a platform? Maybe through social media or other projects.
That's where you see a completely different picture emerge. When Syrian women share their own stories, you see incredible resilience, creativity, adaptability, agency. They aren't just victims, they're actively navigating incredibly difficult situations.
So these alternative platforms reveal a much richer, more empowering reality.
Absolutely. It really underscores how vital it is to empower marginalized groups to tell their own stories, to control their own narratives.
Okay, so wrapping this up then, we've covered quite a bit the need to challenge Eurocentric bias in how we even study communication.
The importance of bringing in those non-Western and indigenous perspectives, not just as subjects, but as sources of theory.
Recognizing how power imbalances fundamentally shape intercultural interactions.
And critically looking at media, especially how groups like refugees are often represented in really simplistic and damaging ways.
It really boils down to a need for ongoing critical thinking, doesn't it? About the theories we use, the media we consume.
Yeah, constantly asking, whose perspective is this? Whose voice is missing? How might power be influencing what I'm seeing or hearing?
Definitely a lot to think about in our own interactions and how we make sense of the world. And remember, if you want to explore these concepts further, the full summary and practice tests are up on gradeguru.nl.
It really leaves you wondering, how many stories are we missing just because we haven't learned how to listen for them yet?